I chaired the panel on entrepreneurial Europe, and notably on how we can strengthen innovation systems. So it was a little bit about meta-knowledge, not knowledge per se, but how do you organize the knowledge. And basically we had, besides a very lively discussion throughout the 2 hours, we had basically 4 pillars that we discussed. We started with an introduction on what actually is innovation, and I reminded the group that innovation is a relatively new word, about a little bit over a century old, coined for the first time by Joseph Schumpeter, who was an Austrian economist, and he defined innovation as new combinations. So not inventions, but new combinations, how you take something from one discipline and apply that in another discipline, a little bit alike, in the cuisine, when you take one ingredient and you mix it with another ingredient, you may actually get a new dish. The second thing that we discussed in that introduction was that we have actually arrived, although many people do not realize that, in a non-linear era as far as humanity is concerned. And the simplest parameter to check that on is that it took us about 200,000 years until 1840 to get to 1 billion people. Then it took us 90 years until 1930 to get to 2 billion people. It then took us just 30 years to get to 3 billion people in 1960, and it has doubled since already. Now, you don't have to be a mathematician to see that that is not linear, and in fact, that is kind of exponential. Why is that relevant? Demographics are extremely relevant because they are the most important factor that determine the future. Because it's demographics that drive natural resource use. It is demographics that actually cause environmental stresses. And it is very important to realize that we are now in an era where things will move ever faster and we may be caught out with the measures that we think of. Now there's also perhaps one thing, a statement that we made this morning by Alfred Bartlett, who some of you may know, but many more of you may know a saying that he's famous for. He said, the greatest weakness of human mankind is its inability to understand the exponential function. Now that's particularly relevant when you are in an exponential era. So that was like a warning up front. Now there's good news as well. And actually last night Timothy O'Shea from Edinburgh University already referred to Moore's law. And that means that, computer power and computer speed double every 18 months. And that actually means, ladies and gentlemen, that you all have in your handbags and in your pockets more computing power than Houston Control had in the 60s when they were actually managing the first landing on the moon, just in your pocket and in your handbags. Now, the question is not whether we now have more than we had last year or 5 years ago, but the question is, do we have enough for the challenge that we have now? If you are driving a car in a curve and you say, look, my wheels are turned in with 20 degrees, and I say to you, yes, but the curve is 30 degrees, you're still going to have an accident. So it's always the relevance of the solution relative to the challenge. We had 3 very interesting speakers. We had somebody from industry, somebody from the media, and somebody representing policymakers. And the industrialist was somebody with truly global experience, having worked in the United States, in Asia, and hailing actually from there, from the Middle East even, and in Europe. And having worked in the US, he commented on the culture and the environment of innovation in the United States. And he said, of course, this whole venture capital availability, the culture around risk and failure. If in Europe you fail, well, you get a cross through your name for the rest of your life. In America, they say, aha, that's fine, so you will not make that mistake again. We count this as experience. It's a very, very different approach, so kind of an innovation culture. He also commented on the fact that, of course, both the United States and China are very big home markets. And whilst we are a very big market with 502 inhabitants, we are a very fragmented market as far as legislation, culture, language is concerned. And in China, although they've got multiple languages there as well, and in the United States, they are bigger markets. And that is a reason why the 3 A's come from those markets. The 3 A's being Alibaba, Apple, Amazon, huge ventures that often start as startups less than 1 or 2 decades ago, who actually go to IPOs and reap in millions of dollars. However, he said, it's not all gloom for Europe, because Europe also has a number of features which are actually uniquely suitable for innovation. And the 2 he mentioned there was actually, it's the diversity of Europe. It's the fact that we've got so many cultures and languages means that in Europe, we have developed a culture of collaboration. And collaboration, if you go back to the initial definition of innovation as being new combinations, then those that have a culture of cooperation ought to have an advantage when you talk about the ability to come forth with innovations. He summarized the conditions, that prevail, in his opinion, in Silicon Valley, to a certain extent in Tel Aviv. An attempt was made, of course, as many of you know, in Sophia Antipolis in the south of France, and perhaps a little bit now in Berlin, as you have to have the right investment environment. You have to have the good, bright engineers. There should also be a positive view on towards risk-taking, saying, well, okay, I'm going to do my utmost best for 3 or 4 years, and I may win big time. And if I do not win big time, well, I always get a job, and I only sacrifice 3 or 4 years of my life. But that is not a very European mindset, because we are more risk-averse and rather have a permanent job without having that risk. Very importantly said, is that failure is not seen as a personal failure, but as an experience gained. And we talked about the importance of networks, network communities. And actually one of the debaters talked about a chain being defined by the weakest link. And of course the advantage of a network is that if one link breaks, still many other links exist. So actually the multidimensional networks are very fortuitous conditions to have. We then spoke about with the media dimension. Now, without the light, it's slightly difficult to read, but we talked about basically it's like a door with 3 locks. And if you're on this side of the door, let's say inside this room, and we want to get out, and you only have 2 keys of 3 locks, well, you know what the conclusion is: we're going to stay in this room, because you need all 3 keys to open the 3 locks. And the 3 are, first of all, you need the innovations coming from either industry or academia at universities. Secondly, we need the enabling framework conditions that are made by policymakers to actually scale this up to the first commercial scale ventures. And then, last but not least important, also to have in society actually I use the word acceptance. One of the speakers said, no, it's not acceptance, it's actually adoption of these new innovations, to have them at large scale rollout. And what's really important about innovation is the following. We do not have to be pessimistic about the number of innovations. There are plenty of them. So in a way you might argue that in view of the challenge that many of us do not recognize, being exponential, in actual fact the basic innovations are there. But if they only exist in laboratories of industry or large universities, it is actually of no social relevance. The social relevance only comes when you get to large-scale rollout or implementation of these innovations to really valorize their benefits. So the media person said, basically we are living in a world of 3 levels. We have the levels of facts, we have the levels of cycles, and then we got the long-term structural drivers. And he said we are actually trapped in the world of facts. And earlier I had made an explanation about the dichotomy between, on the one hand, what is urgent and what is important. Now, some things are both urgent and important, so that's really what we should do. What is not urgent and not important we should not be doing, but we've got to promise the 2 other boxes. So there are things that are urgent but not important, like those facts that we always talk about. And there are things that are important but not urgent, in the sense that if we don't solve the problem this week, we can always have a go next week. However, if you keep postponing what is important but not urgent long enough, it automatically becomes important and urgent, and then you've got fewer degrees of freedom to actually tackle the problem, and that is why early action is important. He also said, we live very much in the facts, lots of interesting things, but what is often interesting is not really what is important. I thought that was an interesting distinction. He said the media themselves, even though he recognized that in the recent, I don't know how many people here are familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer. So every year, I think 40,000 people are interviewed all over the world, and they are asked, who do you trust? Do you trust government? Do you trust industry? Do you trust CEOs? Do you trust bankers? Do you trust the church, the military? Do you trust the NGOs or the media? And they measure that every year. And what is interesting is also to see the deltas. Now, the last version they had an absolute landslide fall in trust in the world. So government has lost big time in trust. CEOs are not trusted. Bankers' trust went through the floor. Even academia lost in trust, which is very unusual because of the email scandal whereby a minority view was kind of suppressed. Well, that's not what we accept of academia, and the result of it was that people now trust academia less. The two categories that have lost least in trust were actually NGOs, a little bit, and least of all, the media. Now, of course, if you read quality media, then that is good news, but we all know that media are not only quality media, and if that is all believed, then we perhaps are in great difficulties. And Luca actually said we, as the media sector, we're suffering from business model problems, and he said something that is my learning point for today personally. He said, we always talk about social media, but in social media, you basically are connected to people you like and who think the same. And things like searching machines, they know what you liked in the past, and when things come up, they will present you first the things that people you like also think. Now that actually means that we're getting more and more into tunnel vision because we only get to see what we like to see. Opposing to that, and for me that was a new term, so I have to thank Luca for that, he said there's also civic or civil. I wrote down civic, where is Luca? He's not here. I thought he said civic media, and civic media is basically a group of people where relevant discussion, relevant discourse takes place, irrespective whether you like those people or not, but it's more focused on the content, and we should get more from that. I commented that I read an article not too long ago about the connectivity paradox. Connectivity, as you all know, means that we are better connected to the rest of the world than we ever were before in human mankind's history. You can look up everywhere in the world. If you've got a good idea, you can commercialize it everywhere in the world. Those are the positive sides of the greater connectivity. Greater connectivity, however, also has some downsides. And those of you that understand the concept of herd behavior, whereby we all go at the same time to the left and all at the same time to the right, and do that very frequently, that actually increases the volatility. And greater volatility always means more risk. And here we're talking about societal risk. The comparison is a little bit if you're in a big ship and all the passengers would all go to starboard at the same time and then move to port, the whole ship will go a little bit like that. And then you probably would have a captain that says, will you please stop doing this, otherwise I'll put a few of the passengers overboard, and then it will stop.
Or then the captain is Italian and he leaves.
And he leaves, or he jumps, or he falls in a boat, correct. And of course the question then is, what is in the metaphorical ship of society, who is the speaker that can actually say, well, why are we moving like herds one way and the other and shaking the boat or rocking the boat too much? The last speaker represented policymakers. And after a brief introduction about the role, the continued important role of innovation in the new structure of the European Commission, we then actually went to talk about, well, what can policymakers do and what can they not do? And because the industry speaker had earlier spoken about the innovation culture and the mindset related to innovation, said, well, that is something that policymakers cannot impose. We cannot impose a mindset on society. However, education is of course something that we can influence, and that 21st century skills are indispensable for the citizens of the 21st century is of course a no-brainer. He also said that a number of cases, country-specific recommendation and guidance had been given to the individual member states to precisely enhance the innovation framework in those particular countries, because there we of course are all different, and therefore the improvement pathways would be different for each member state as well. As far as the funding is concerned of the very large budgets that the EU have, I was very pleased as a former industrialist to hear that they very much look at the desired outcome. So not just like we need 20% of this kind of project and 20% of that kind of project, but it actually looked whether the collectiveness of those projects would actually deliver the desired outcome for society, and that is a good thing. The final discussion was a little bit about, because so far it had been about funding and innovation policy, but more general goal-setting policy.